I've been working as a barista in this little cafe for about 2 years now. It's one of those places where regulars make up half the clientele, and you get used to seeing the same faces every day. But there was one guy who started showing up about a month ago, and honestly, he gave me the creeps right from the start. He always came in late, just before we closed, like clockwork. He'd order the same thing, a black coffee, and take it to the corner table, the one furthest from the counter. At first, I didn't think much of it. People like quiet spots, right? But he never drank the coffee. Not even a sip. It just sat there, cooling, while he stared at the wall or fiddled with his phone, which, by the way, never seemed to actually be on. Last night was slower than usual. Barely anyone came in after 7 p.m. As the clock ticked closer to closing time, I realized he was the only customer left. He'd done his usual thing, walked in without making eye contact, ordered in a low voice, and retreated to his corner. But this time, something felt off. It wasn't just how quiet the place was, it was him. The way he sat there, almost too still, like he was waiting for something or someone. When it hit closing time, I started cleaning up and made it a point to glance his way, thinking he'd take the hint. But he didn't move at all. It was like he hadn't even noticed the cafe was empty except for him and me. I walked over to his table, trying to keep my voice steady. I told him the cafe was closing and that he'd need to leave. He didn't look up right away, just kept staring at the empty cup in front of him. After a moment, he muttered that he was waiting for someone. That was all he said. No explanation, no apology, nothing else. I tried to ignore how uneasy his response made me feel, but the tone of his voice was strange, like he wasn't talking to me at all but to himself. I told him he'd have to wait outside because I needed to lock up. He stood up slowly, moving like each step took real effort. The whole thing felt wrong, like there was something about him that didn't belong there. After I locked the door, that uneasy feeling still lingered in the air, like he'd left a part of himself behind. It's hard to explain, but it felt heavy, almost tangible. I tried to shake it off, joking to myself about needing a drink to forget the weirdness of that shift, and went home. The next morning, I got to work a bit earlier than usual. My coworker, Lisa, was already there, scrolling through her phone with this strange look on her face. She asked if I'd heard about the man from the night before. I didn't understand what she meant, so I asked her to explain. That's when she showed me a news article. The headline made my stomach drop. Local man wanted in connection to ongoing police investigation. And there he was, in the blurry photo attached to the article. Man from the corner table. I couldn't stop staring at the photo on Lisa's phone. It wasn't just similar, it was him, down to the way his jacket looked slightly too big for him. I asked Lisa what the article said, and she summarized it quickly. The man was connected to some kind of local case, though the details were vague. The police were looking for him in relation to a string of disappearances that had been making headlines in the past few weeks. My stomach churned as she read out loud that he had last been spotted near downtown, which was only a few blocks from our cafe. She didn't seem as unsettled as I was, probably because she hadn't spent the night before practically alone with him. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just dodged something horrible. As the day went on, I found myself glancing at the corner table more than I usually did. It was like I was expecting him to walk in again, but I also dreaded the thought of it. Around lunchtime, a group of regulars came in, laughing and chatting, and for a while it helped me forget the unease. But later, as I was restocking supplies in the back, I noticed something odd. There was a folded napkin tucked behind one of the machines, in the spot where I usually cleaned up after closing. It didn't belong there. I was sure I'd wiped everything down the night before. When I unfolded it, I froze. Written in shaky, uneven letters were the words, "Still waiting." I stood there, staring at the napkin for what felt like forever. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how it got there. I had locked the doors, double-checked everything before leaving the night before. No one else had been in the cafe since we opened that morning. The handwriting was unsettling, almost childlike, as if whoever wrote it was in a rush or not entirely steady. I stuffed the napkin into my apron pocket, not sure why, but I didn't want Lisa or anyone else to see it. Something about it felt personal, like it was meant for me. For the rest of the day, every sound, every shadow out of the corner of my eye made me jump. That evening, as we were getting ready to close, I made sure to keep myself busy near the counter. Part of me was hoping he wouldn't show up, but another part wanted to know if he would. Time dragged as we neared closing, but he never came in. I should have felt relieved, but I didn't. The empty corner table felt more ominous than his presence ever did. After Lisa left, I locked up and turned off the lights, but the thought of that napkin wouldn't leave my mind. I finally pulled it out and stared at the words again under the dim light from the street lamp outside. As I stood there, I thought I heard a faint tap on the glass door behind me. I froze, my back to the door, every nerve in my body on edge. The tapping was faint but deliberate, like someone was testing if I'd notice. Slowly, I turned around, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. The street outside was mostly empty, just a few cars passing by in the distance. But there, in the faint glow of the street lamp, I thought I saw a figure standing just out of the light's reach. It wasn't clear enough to make out details, just a shape, motionless, watching. I stood there, clutching the napkin in one hand and the keys in the other, not sure if I should open the door or call someone. Then, just as quickly as I noticed the figure, it stepped back into the shadows and disappeared. The next day, I couldn't bring myself to mention what happened to anyone. Lisa would have probably brushed it off, and the thought of explaining it out loud made me feel crazy. But I couldn't stop thinking about the man, the napkin, and the figure outside the cafe. I decided to check the news again, hoping for some kind of update on the case. What I found made my stomach drop. The article now included more details, including a timeline of the man's movements. According to the report, he had been spotted near the cafe the previous evening at almost the exact time I had seen the figure in the shadows. But what stopped me cold was the last line. Police believe the suspect may no longer be alive but are continuing to investigate. I stared at the screen, rereading that line over and over. If he wasn't alive, then what had been in the cafe? Who had written the note, and who had tapped on the glass? I still don't have the answers, and honestly, I am not sure I want them. I stopped working the late shift after that. Every time I pass the cafe at night, I feel that same heavy unease, like I am being watched. I can't help but glance at the corner table through the window, half expecting to see him sitting there, staring at his untouched coffee. The napkin is still in my drawer at home, hidden under a pile of papers. I haven't looked at it since, but sometimes I think I can hear those same faint taps, as if someone or something is still waiting. Working the night shift at a pub downtown can be chaotic, but it's nothing I can't handle. My name's Lena, I am 27, and I've been bartending at the Fox's Den for 3 years now. It's the kind of place where people come to blow off steam after work-loud music, neon lights, and the constant clatter of glasses. Fridays are our busiest nights, and last Friday started like any other. I clocked in at 5 p.m., tied my hair back, and dove straight into the rush. But as I grabbed the first batch of lemons to slice, I noticed something strange through the front window. A white, unmarked van parked directly across the street. The headlights were off, and it didn't look like anyone was inside. I figured it was just someone stopping for a quick bite at the diner next door, and didn't think much of it. The crowd picked up quickly, and for a while, I forgot all about the van. Orders came in non-stop whiskey sours, vodka sodas, tequila shots. My coworkers and I were barely keeping up. But when I got a short breather around 9:30 p.m., I glanced outside again. The van was still there, in the exact same spot. No one had gotten in or out, and the windows were too tinted to see inside. The diner had closed hours ago, and the rest of the street was mostly empty, except for the occasional passerby. It started to gnaw at me, but I told myself it was probably nothing. Still, a weird feeling crept in, like I was being watched. I shook it off, though who has time for paranoia when you've got a line of drunk regulars yelling for more beer? By the time last call rolled around at 1:30 a.m., I was exhausted. The crowd had thinned out, and I was wiping down the bar while my coworker, Sam, collected glasses from the tables. That's when I noticed the van again. It hadn't moved an inch all night, but now, the faint glow of a cigarette flickered behind the windshield. My chest tightened as I realized someone was definitely in there, and they were watching the pub. I told myself to stay calm, maybe it was just someone waiting for a friend. But deep down, something about it felt off. The pub was one of the few places still open on the block, and it was odd for anyone to just sit there for hours without doing anything. When we finally closed up, I locked the front door and hesitated for a second before turning to Sam. I asked him if he minded walking me to my car that night, trying to sound casual. He gave me a funny look but nodded. As we stepped outside, the street was eerily quiet, the only sound coming from a distant car horn. I stole a quick glance at the van. The driver was visible now, a man in a baseball cap with a scruffy beard, sitting perfectly still. His eyes locked on me as I fumbled with my keys, and my stomach churned. Sam didn't seem to notice, but I felt like every step I took was being tracked. As Sam and I walked toward my car, I couldn't stop glancing back at the van. The man was still there, completely still, but his presence felt oppressive, like a shadow hanging over me. I tried to focus on the sound of Sam chatting about something from earlier in the shift, but my nerves were shot. I kept my voice steady as I thanked him for walking with me. It wasn't something I usually needed, but tonight felt different. My hands were trembling as we reached my car. While I unlocked the driver's side door, I could feel the man's eyes on me from inside the van, like he was waiting for something. Sam said goodnight and headed off toward his bike, leaving me alone in the quiet parking lot. I turned on the engine, and for a brief moment I felt a small wave of relief until I saw the van's headlights flicker on in my rearview mirror. My heart started racing, but the van didn't move right away. Maybe I was just being paranoid, I told myself, trying to stay calm. But as soon as I pulled out onto the street, I heard the low growl of its engine. The van started following me, keeping a steady distance. I wanted to believe it was a coincidence, but every turn I made, every random side street I took, it stayed behind me. It wasn't close enough to seem aggressive, but it wasn't far enough for me to feel safe either. By the time I pulled into my apartment complex, my hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that it took effort to release them. I sat in my car for a moment, watching the van creep past the entrance to my apartment complex. It didn't stop or pull a nit, just rolled by slowly, as if the driver was surveying the area. My stomach twisted into knots as I waited for it to disappear down the street. Once it was gone, I grabbed my bag and made a dash for the front door of my building, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. My apartment was on the second floor, and the old stairwell creaked under my hurried steps. By the time I locked my door behind me, my chest was tight, and my breath came in quick, shallow bursts. I leaned against the door, listening for any sound outside, but the hallway was silent. Forcing myself to calm down, I went to the kitchen, filled a glass with water, and tried to shake off the tension. "It's fine," I muttered under my breath. "You are just overreacting." But that brief relief shattered when I heard the distant rumble of an engine outside. My apartment faced the street, so I cautiously peeked through the blinds, my fingers trembling, my stomach dropped. The van was parked a few houses down, its silhouette dimly visible under a streetlight. The driver wasn't in sight, but the vehicle itself felt like a threat, as if it was waiting for the right moment to strike. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. I stayed crouched by the window, barely breathing, waiting for any sign of Sam. Outside, the man hadn't moved. He flicked his cigarette to the ground, crushed it under his boot, and leaned back against the van, hands stuffed into his pockets. Every now and then, he glanced down the street, as if he were expecting someone or something. My phone buzzed again, and I jumped. It was Sam. He texted that he was pulling up, and I let out a shaky breath, relief flooding through me. A moment later, I saw Sam's car turn onto my street. Its headlights washed over the van, and the man straightened up, his posture tense. I thought for a second that Sam's arrival might scare him off, but instead, he calmly climbed back into the van. The engine roared to life, and the vehicle sped off down the road, disappearing into the night. I watched until the taillights vanished, my body still frozen in place. When Sam knocked on my door a minute later, I let him in, my voice trembling as I tried to explain everything. He looked out the window, but the street was empty now, as if none of it had ever happened. Sam stayed for a while, trying to calm me down. He kept reassuring me that the guy was probably just some creep, but I could tell even he was a little shaken by how specific it all seemed. "You should call the police," he said, pacing my living room. But what could I even report? The van was gone, and no actual crime had been committed. Still, the idea of being alone in my apartment after everything made my skin crawl. Sam offered to crash on my couch for the night, and I didn't hesitate to agree. Even with someone else in the apartment, sleep didn't come easily. Every creak in the building made me jump, and I kept expecting to hear the low hum of an engine outside. When morning finally came, the street looked completely normal, no sign of the van, no strange figures lurking nearby. I tried to shake it off as best I could, convincing myself that maybe it was over. But later that afternoon, as I left for my shift at the pub, I froze in my tracks. Tucked under my windshield wiper was a piece of paper, folded neatly. My stomach dropped as I unfolded it, and read the message scrawled in thick, blocky letters. "You're being what?" Even now, I can't get that night out of my head. It's been months, and nothing else has happened. No strange vans, no cryptic notes, but I still find myself glancing over my shoulder more than I used to. Every time I see a white van parked on the street, my stomach tightens, and my mind goes back to those tense moments. Who was that man? What did he want? I've replayed every detail 100 times, trying to piece together an explanation, but I always come up empty. The only thing I know for sure is that someone was watching me that night, and the thought of it still sends chills down my spine.